introduction. Bore you further with introductions, but actually would like to give a floor to what I think is going to be a great keynote speech from Dirk. So Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, for the introduction and also for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. I think it's an amazing conference. I have not been able to attend every session. I had some other things to join as well, but a very attractive program and a timely initiative. One slight correction on my introduction. So I actually have left OECD already. The 1st of June was the date of my retirement, but I stay connected with the OECD. I do a number of projects with them, but let's say the managerial stress has disappeared and gives me a bit more time and opportunity and freedom to do things that I really like to do, such as giving this presentation. What I would like to do this afternoon is maybe going a little bit more to the helicopter perspective, to the macro picture, based on what we have learned at the OECD on when we are monitoring the pandemic and everything that has happened in education. So we try to really closely monitor developments in all OECD and also non-OECD countries by surveys, by interactions, by meetings. It's not perfect. So we don't have a perfect database. We don't have actually our regular data collections were interrupted. You probably know that PISA has been postponed with 18 months or so. Also, our TALIS survey has been postponed. Our data collections for education at a glance are suffering. So we cannot rely on our regular databases, and they also have a bit of a time gap. So we did try to initiate some specific initiatives, but they are not perfect, and we are still struggling to have an excellent picture of what has happened and what is happening today. But I'll give you the best possible picture that we have. We are preparing a couple of upcoming publications, so stay tuned. We are preparing a huge report on COVID-19 and education, and there is, I think in May, interim report has been published already, and some of the slides that Andreas Schleicher, my former boss, used in the introductory presentation came also from that source. Let's maybe first go to before the pandemic, because one of the interesting questions that we are now asking, were our systems really prepared for the pandemic waiting to happen? And a little bit in the same way as with the financial crisis in 2008, now many people say, well, why didn't you see it coming? Because many experts already alarmed our societies for the possibility of a pandemic. And that's true. We were all surprised, but actually we should not have been surprised. And especially we should have been better prepared. Our TALIS 2018 data showed that actually we were not prepared. Our systems were not able to flexibly switch from normal teaching and learning experiences to online teaching. The digital environments were not ready. In some countries, they were better than in others. Teachers were not trained. Teachers were not using digital technologies themselves. So all kinds of indicators, and I could list a lot of charts on this, indicated that actually our systems were not prepared, and especially our teachers were not prepared. This is also a chart showing that the willingness to use digital technologies is very much influenced by the age distribution of teachers. the age distribution in countries' teachers' workforce was an important factor in the readiness to also switch to digital technologies. The availability of online platforms. Some countries did a lot better than others. The Netherlands is a little bit in between both extremes. But the availability of really workable and flexible online learning platforms was not really sufficient to cope with the surprise of the pandemic. We could extend a lot on this topic, but let me conclude by saying our education systems were not prepared, and that's a collective responsibility. I don't think that we can just say governments did not invest enough in making education systems well prepared. I think on every level in the education system we were not prepared, and that's a collective responsibility that we have to take. And then COVID-19 struck education. It was like a lightning for the Flemish community of Belgium, where I come from. March the 13th, when the government suddenly decided, 13th in March in 2020, of course, when governments decided to close schools, it was a complete surprise. And then we had the first wave of school closures. Andreas already showed you the data that we have on the length of school closures, and the surprising thing is that the length of the school closures in the first wave, so between March and June 2020, was very, very different. Some countries closed for short periods, closed completely or only partially. Other countries closed for a much longer period of time. Or even continued closing even after the first wave. And this chart, which Andreas also showed, is actually quite worrisome and quite surprising. So the length of school closures was negatively associated with the PISA outcomes in PISA 2018. So the better education systems closed their schools for shorter periods of time than the countries which did not so well in PISA 2018. That also suggests that if we can speak about learning loss because of school closures, and I'm coming back to that question, that the learning losses probably have been greater in countries which already did not do very well in PISA 2018. So that our expectation is that when we will do the PISA again, probably 23, then we will see larger differences in learning outcomes between countries than we have seen already in 2018. The proportion of teachers were asked to move to online teaching in most countries. That was actually the strategy in almost all countries, and they did that more or less successfully. But the proportion of teachers that were indicated in our surveys that moved to online teaching differed among countries. And I think in secondary level, close to 60–70% of teachers had to move to online teaching for the time of for the period of the school closures. Other teachers remained in schools and catered for parts of the school population. And I think that has been a strategy which was successfully implemented in a number of countries and not in some other countries. I'm personally very much in favor of a much more flexible strategy, so where teachers can combine online learning with in-school learning and teaching for specific target groups of pupils, etc. So partially closing schools and catering for specific groups of pupils and students in the school and catering for others by online learning is actually a strategy which, in my view, was much more effective than completely closing school and going to online teaching. Countries were also more or less successful in supporting teachers when they had to move to online learning. And you see here the numbers of countries which indicated in our surveys some of the most frequent strategies in dealing with that. Adapting content, so revising lesson plans came out as number one, which is quite instructive because in some of the countries that I know of, this did not happen. So it was actually more in non-European countries that this happened. Instructions on distance teaching and also implementing low-tech solutions. It is quite surprising that in some countries, television, radio was not used to complement or supplement online teaching by digital technologies and the internet. Some emergency special training happened in many countries. Professional development, so specific workshops, psychosocial emotional support, etc. So you see a broad range of strategies, and of course we don't have really methodologically sound evaluation studies on these interventions, but that's something that needs to be done because I will talk at the end about lessons that we have to learn, but we have to evaluate the strategies very carefully. And of course, all these things have happened, and they happened most intensively during the first wave in the spring of 2020. And also the research community was not really prepared to quickly launch evaluation studies at the time that these interventions happened. So we actually miss a lot of the information that could have been collected. What less well known is also what happened to non-formal and informal learning. And we have now a couple of surveys which indicated that non-formal learning, at least from the perspective of the time invested in it, also decreased, maybe not dramatically, but the decrease is significant. And also informal learning for workers and for the adult population decreased. I think this is also relevant for school education because when formal learning moved to online learning, the expectation was that the instruction time, which was in most cases reduced, would be complemented by informal learning. And I think we should not be too optimistic about that. All data suggests that actually the informal learning on average decreased, but also became more socially different according to specific target groups. So there is an interesting US study which indicated, based on Google search data, that in well-off residential areas, students who stayed at home learned intensively also on the internet by looking for education resources, exploring websites, etc. Whereas students living in less well-off areas, based on Google search data, did not show the same practice. So it's not only the formal instruction time that matters, but also the informal learning activities of students when they were home. And the consequences of the combination of formal and informal learning have to be taken together in order to explain eventually learning loss. And that's a topic which is often neglected, so that's why I'm also showing this slide. What about learning loss? And I'm not pretending to give you the final word on this. I think this is still a lot in discussion. There is still a lot of research going on. I hope that we will see some more research results being published in the coming months. I'm not too optimistic, though. I think opportunities have been missed to really assess learning loss at the moment that it was right to do that assessment. So it becomes more difficult when you go further in time. There was a very interesting review now by Harry Patrinos and Robin Donnelly, just published, I think, 2 weeks ago, and who made a systematic overview of all the available research. And they were actually only able to identify 8 research projects which could stand the test of methodological robustness. I think you probably know very well 2 of them, and so the study of our Oxford colleagues on the Netherlands, and then the project by Maldonado and de Witte in the Flemish community of Belgium. The conclusion of Harry Patrinos is actually that 7 of the 8 indicate some kind of learning loss. But the intensity and the variance of the learning losses were completely different across countries, across those research projects. It could have been, this can be explained by the design of the study, could also be explained, of course, by the variation across countries itself. But it's very difficult to make some really sound conclusions of this. I'm trying to give you a little bit of an overview now. So this comes from the project of Maldonado and de Witte that has been, I think, presented also this afternoon. Quite a severe conclusion. So 20% of the standard deviation learning loss between June 2019 and 2020. That's very big. It's actually the biggest learning loss that we can see across the 8 studies that have been identified as reliable. In the UK, we have seen, this is based on a survey of teachers, so not really an assessment, not a real test, but the research is interesting because it gives you an idea of the distribution over disadvantaged and advantaged schools, which is indicating the equity aspect in learning loss. I personally, I'm quite moderate on my assessment of learning loss on average, but I think the much more important conclusion is the equity distribution or the inequity distribution. So you have huge numbers of students who have been inflicted by learning loss because they come from disadvantaged backgrounds, did not have the support systems at home, etc., etc. I'm much more at ease with, let's say, the situation for the more advantaged students, which did not or only experience a very slight learning loss, or even did better than in a normal school year. So the distribution is actually much more relevant than the average. And I'm becoming more and more critical of those researchers who only report on the average learning loss. I think the averages are meaningless. What matters here in this topic is the distribution. This probably you know very well. It's the study of our Oxford colleagues on the Dutch grade 6 schools, and it's probably the same kind of picture that as you get from Maldonado and de Witte, but a bit more moderate. So they come to learning losses which are more or less 0.8% over the standard deviation, and that's much more moderate than what we have seen for the Flemish community. Again, on this topic of distribution and variation, because and I think Andreas used that slide as well. It is interesting because it's based on real-time data on populations, actually, not on samples. And it's based on data collected by an active learning platform for learning mathematics in some states of the United States. And you see what happened before the pandemic, and then suddenly, well, when schools closed in those states, what happened? So what happened is actually the distribution changed. It's so the top income quartile students pretty much stayed on track. It's just that the middle income and the bottom income quartile students, they started to suffer, and they did not recover when time went by. So they actually followed the same trajectory of learning as the students from well-off families, but at a much lower level, and they were not able to recover from that. That's I think that's an extremely interesting chart, and I think it's significant for a lot of what has happened during the school closures, at least in the spring of 2020. Another interesting topic: study time. This is a Swiss study which indicates that study time decreased. It's very difficult to make a sound interpretation. I am personally not convinced that study time is a good indicator for learning loss. I also think that some students were much more efficient in the time they used when studying online. Especially well-off students who have support systems, who have good internet connections, etc., etc. They probably did well with less study time. But if study time decreases for students who are already in a disadvantaged situation, I think it's much more detrimental. It's much more problematic. But my personal take on this is that we should not focus too much on the amount of instruction time that has been lost. I know that for policymakers, and certainly also in the Flemish community, the minister is really focused on the number of instruction days that have been lost. I personally don't think that this is a very relevant indicator. It's interesting to monitor study time. So I think this Swiss study is very interesting in itself. And we have, unfortunately, very little data, very few data on study time and what has happened with it. But I don't think personally that there is any strong correlation between the number of days of instruction lost or the number of hours lost and the harm that has been inflicted on the learning process. Finally, two examples of studies that indicated no learning loss and then actually learning progress, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it's very much worth looking into. This is a French study. It's not a research project. It's the usual annual report of the French ministry in September, based on the entrance examinations that they do, the tests that they do when starting a new school year. And actually, both for French and for mathematics, the results in September 2020 were better than the results in September 2019. this is not a sample, this is just the normal population-wide assessment when students start the school year. And the school year started with students who had better assessments than they had the years before, which is actually quite striking. It's certainly worth considering why in France we have this kind of result. Australia is probably not a very typical example with regard to school closures and COVID-19, because, well, as you know, Australia, at least in 2020, had a very harsh anti-COVID regime with confinement just based on a few cases in some cities. But in this research project in the area around Sydney, also progress was found, not learning loss. So the results of 2020 were better, both for mathematics and for reading, than the results of 2019. But in the same project, they also found increased variance, so increased inequality in the learning outcomes. So no learning loss on average, but increased inequality in learning outcomes. But just to give you an indication that learning loss is a very complicated reality, and that we do not have sufficient data to say something completely conclusive about it. Also for those countries which have data, like the Netherlands, like the Flemish community, it's only based on a sample for 1 year, a very meaningful year, the sixth year of primary school is very important, but still it's not, we cannot conclude that all students in all parts of the education trajectory suffered from school closures. What all these studies found was the role of the home environment and the role of parents. And I think this is something that needs to be looked into much more carefully. What happened when students stayed at home, were learning online, what kind of support were parents providing, etc. Again, very scattered data, but interesting data to look into. Here you see some results from France and the UK on the incidence of support. I have to move a couple of things in my own picture. Yeah, so the support of parents, well, most parents provided support for less than 1 hour a day. But also larger, more extensive support was provided by quite a meaningful number of parents. And this is quite interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of data on the distribution and the link to socially advantaged or disadvantaged background families. But actually, my impression is that parents in the beginning did really care to provide enough support. Of course, the availability of teleworking was an important variable in that. And our colleagues in the Employment and Labor Directorate of the OECD have also assessed the prevalence of teleworking and the feasibility of teleworking. One of the interesting things that they found was the availability of teleworking is closely related to literacy proficiency of parents. So it's where the high-skilled parents, often working in high-skilled professions and jobs, who were able to telework and who were able to then also spare the time to provide support for their students. Low-skilled workers did not have the same amount of teleworking available, so were probably not as frequently at home than high-skilled parents in high-skilled jobs. So the social distribution of teleworking probably had an impact on the social distribution of support systems at home.
Dirk, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we have just 4 minutes left to the end of the session, and maybe we would like to have one question asked. So I don't know. Well,
okay.
to give you a point.
Yeah, I'll skip. Yeah, I'm sorry for that. I'm so fascinated by this topic that I always expand too long. So just I will skip a few things, but just this is also important. The psychological stress on parents. The parents with children had really social emotional stress when coping with students learning at home. I'm skipping this to move to some of the remediation strategies. This picture is interesting because it shows that different decisions were taken at different levels. So closing schools was a decision taken by governments centrally, but coping with the educational pedagogical consequences of it was left to schools. So this discrepancy on where decisions were taken and how to deal with the consequences is actually quite meaningful. I think an opportunity has been missed to really empower schools and to really require schools to make the best possible decisions in their own context. Assessment, I think, is really critically important. And what is a little bit frightening of this table is that not so many countries, when the school closures came to an end or the new school year had to start, really provided genuine assessments to assess where each and every individual student could be positioned, and whether there was learning loss or not, or what needed to be done. I think this is one of the major mistakes, in my view, that has been made. At the start of the new school year, September 2020, assessment really failed in a number of countries. On the strategies to address learning gaps, I think this is pretty well known, remedial measures, also the targeted tutoring activities, etc. What is interesting here is what happened with vocational schools. I think one of the problems that we face in addressing COVID-19 in education is that we forget about vocational schools. And I really would like to put some attention to that. We have not, again, we have diverted our attention to the academically most privileged tracks in education. And in many approaches, policies, even research projects, we have not given enough attention to vocational education. I will finalize with some topics that I found really important on thinking and rethinking the consequences of the pandemic for education, and maybe also in preparing better for the future, the curriculum. I'm not convinced personally that we have to save the curriculum as it has been defined before the pandemic by all possible means. I think curriculum flexibility is a very important topic, and I'm very much inspired by, in my view, a brilliant book by Justin Reich and Meta from, Justin is from MIT, and Meta is from, as you know, Harvard School, Graduate School of Education. Who make a point, and let's look critically at the curriculum again, and let's do a kind of Marie Kondo approach, selecting those elements, and do that in advance of a pandemic, so that teachers and schools know very well what they can move to when they have to reduce instruction time. And they describe a whole methodology to do that, and I think that's really worth considering. Assessment is, in my view, critically important. I also think it's a right of students to be assessed, and in many countries, the rights of students have been violated. Harm has been done on their further educational trajectories by not doing the assessment well, by giving their ill-founded advice based on assessment. I think for the Netherlands, it has been a huge mistake, in my view, to abandon the central examinations. I think other solutions were possible. If you want to know what happened with assessment in different countries, this is a useful table, but I will not go into it. A final word on resilience. COVID-19 is not the latest in pandemics that we can expect to happen in the 21st century. That's now the shared opinion of all epidemiologists and people who have much more expertise on this than I have. We have to prepare our education systems. We have to make them resilient. We have to define plans and strategies to make school systems resilient. And that has to be done on the level of teachers, professional development of teachers, powerful, flexible, stress-resistant digital infrastructures, protocols, not only for health and safety, but also for pedagogical strategies, and enabling systems to provide differentiation and flexibility needed to when the time comes. This is my final slide. I leave it on the screen for you to read, but it's the conclusion of one of our interesting publications on COVID-19 and education, 3 lessons to be learned. But it's basically what I have said already.
Wow.
So Tijana, sorry for rushing up in the end, but I wanted to give you this complete picture with a lot of questions, but still some lessons to be learned.
Well, thank you so much, Dirk, and thank you for this passionate sharing. And since we promised really our participants that we are going to end at 5:15, I would suggest for you to share your email, and everyone who has questions actually to contact Dirk directly with his questions, because as we just saw, you're very willing to share so much knowledge about this. So thank you so much for this keynote and for very informative presentation. And if everyone agrees, I would also like to hereby also close this very nice, in my opinion, very nice conference, and thank everyone for attending. And and just to say that, we are very happy that such a diverse public came, and that there were so many interesting sessions. And I hope that especially the teachers and people from educational field have enjoyed it. And I think if there is anything to be said as a last word, I think this conference testifies in how much the need there is for academics to work together with practitioners. And I think it was also a clear invitation from many people from academia today present to educational field to join us in this, adventure, and also attempt to improve education through more application of evidence. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I wish everyone a great evening. And hopefully you will walk away inspired and, ready to further improve education in more evidence-based manner. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, and see you soon.